Welcome to 𝐒𝐭𝐮 Expert Sessions. The presentation will begin shortly.
Hello there, my name is Jorge García Castillo. I am the Head of Support Services for the Danish Refugee Council in Venezuela and Mexico. I've worked in the humanitarian sector for several years already, in Colombia, in conflict context, in displacement, and also in Greece, in refugee crisis. And I will be talking today about humanitarian supply chains and what is the role of that procurement plays in this context. I will be addressing 4 questions mainly. Like first, what are the types of humanitarian supply chains, depending on what are the events that trigger them, and also what are the type of assistance that is provided as part of the humanitarian project. I will be also addressing what are the differences between commercial and humanitarian supply chains. Maybe many of you are aware of what are the differences, or what are the characteristics of a commercial supply chain, and I will be addressing how they contrast with humanitarian setups and humanitarian operations. Then I will talk a little bit about what is the role in procurement in humanitarian supply chains, and also how procurement enables a lot of the operations due to the context that these operations take place. And finally, I will be addressing the topic of how global procurement is relevant for humanitarian supply chain. And this global aspect is very, very important because usually humanitarian operations take place in contexts that are destructured, and they requires external logistics networks to supply the goods and services that are required for the people of concern. So it's also a very important characteristic of how to set up a successful humanitarian supply chain. So starting from the beginning, and before getting into the type of humanitarian supply chain, it's important to land on when do we need a humanitarian supply chain. And we need a humanitarian supply chain when there is usually a humanitarian emergency, and that happens when there is a distressing event that exceeds the capacities of local organizations or local governments to cope with that situation. And humanitarian aid can be delivered locally, can be delivered internationally, can be delivered by NGOs, can be delivered by governments, and it has many actors and stakeholders involved in them. So with that in context, we will first start addressing what are the types of humanitarian supply chains. So starting to characterize a humanitarian supply chain, you have to take into account which aspect it's more important to segment this type of supply chains. So for example, when we consider the event that triggers a humanitarian emergency, we can find 3 different humanitarian supply chains. One are, for example, when a natural disaster occurs. Usually natural disasters, although they are not foreseen event and they are sudden events, usually governments have the capacity and also the duty to deliver on their citizens, to respond to their needs. So they tend to be government-led operations where international organizations provide the extra support that governments cannot cover. So they have a very interesting and important collaborative aspect, how the logistics are deployed when governments cannot cope with a natural disaster, and they ask for the assistance of international humanitarian organizations. Then we have sudden onset displacement. That is, for example, when there is a war or a conflict and hundreds of thousands of people cross the borders between countries, as it occurred in the case of Syria, as it occurred in the case of Myanmar, as it occurred in the case of Ukraine. In these cases, usually there's not always a structured government that can provide that assistance, and you have population in movement that require a different type of approach on how to deliver goods and services to assist this population. And third type are protracted crises. There are crises that have been in place for tens of years, and there are, for example, places in the world like some refugee camps in Kenya, where the second generation of people have been born in the refugee camp. That type of humanitarian supply chain is very different because it's you already have an operation that has been running for many years, and you are working much more in the sense of managing the cash flow and funding that you are required to keep that operation sustained, and not in the sudden needs that suddenly spike in a war or in a natural disaster. So those are the three types of supply chain according to the type of event that triggered them: natural disasters, sudden onset displacement, and protracted crisis. Then if we project that humanitarian supply chain on the type of assistance that is delivered, we can also find three different types of supply chain. The first one is, I think, maybe the most known for the general public, that it's when the humanitarian operation delivers in-kind assistance. So in-kind assistance is, for example, emergency kits or hygiene kits, or these in-kind goods that have to be sourced, transported, and delivered to the beneficiaries. And that requires hard investment in logistics and allows a very last mile delivery of this type of assistance. This type of assistance has in the present years been substituted and complemented also by two types of assistance that are voucher-based assistance and cash-based assistance. So, for example, it's not the same type of supply chain that you have to set up when you have to import goods in a country and deliver them before a monsoon comes, than, for example, when you provide a voucher to a person that is in need, and that person can go to the market and buy a specific set of goods to receive that assistance. In that case, the requirements of that supply chain are not that of hard logistics, that you have to have warehousing and transportation, but you have to have the knowledge of what will be the impact in the market to give vouchers to people in need, that they will be spending, what will be the impact in price, what will they spend the voucher on. And that is also mentioned as condition cash-based assistance, but there is a big difference between voucher-based assistance and cash-based assistance. Usually cash-based assistance is considered as multi-purpose cash assistance. So there is an emergency, there are displaced people, and instead of you deciding for them what they need and providing them that in-kind kit, you give them cash. And giving them cash, they can spend that in their own concept and in their own point of view, what are the things that they most need. So in this case, it's a focus more shift towards understanding how that cash will impact the market, how that cash will generate inflation, and ensuring that providing an influx of cash in the market will not affect the rest of the population, for example, through inflation. So it's a very different approach on how do you manage the stock out from your own in-kind assistance, and how you manage that the cash that you are delivering is generating inflation. There's a lot of empiric evidence of different impacts that cash-based assistance can be, the impact that cash-based assistance can have. And usually you can complement these three types of supply chain. You can have in-kind assistance for a sudden onset emergency, and then, for example, for a refugee camp setting, you can do voucher-based assistance, and maybe for population that it's traveling through and they have the needs of liquid cash for them to cover their needs, you can give them cash, and if they cut the exchange, you can switch back to another type. So it also requires a lot of preparedness in the sense of how do you switch between one modality and the other. And now, getting a little bit deeper on what are the differences between humanitarian and commercial supply chains. So usually when we think of the supply chain as the flow of money, goods, and information from customers to suppliers and back, and that is how we can easily define or maybe conceptualize as a supply chain. In the case of humanitarian supply chain, instead of customers, we have beneficiaries that actually will not pay for the goods that we are giving them or the services. And also the source of income will not be from sales. It will be from donors that provide funds to the humanitarian actors, and they use those funds to buy goods and services that they deliver to beneficiaries. So that change between sales and donations and between customers and beneficiaries creates some unique characteristics in humanitarian supply chain. So first of all, one of the main objectives of humanitarian supply chain is to deliver as fast as possible. Usually you have time pressure to deliver the goods that are required in different settings. If there's a hurricane, if there are 100,000 people crossing the border, you have days to start delivering. And the concept of cost, it's important, but it's on a second level of importance compared to how fast you can deliver. And there's not a focus in margin, right, and in cost savings as in commercial supply chains, where cost savings is a very important, or being cost efficient. It's one of the most important objectives that you can have. Second, in terms of how can you strategize how to set up a humanitarian supply chain versus a commercial supply chain, one of the better things for a commercial supply chain is to have a good forecast, be able to foresee the demand, and be able to plan accordingly and position yourself depending on your demand patterns. What type of service do you want to deliver? In the case of humanitarian supply chains, the events that occur are so hard to foresee, and the variability in this forecast is so wide that instead of trying to know if there will be 50,000 people displaced next month in this place or in this other place, what we usually try to work out in when we set up humanitarian supply chains, it's on preparedness. We try to be ready to be there where we are needed, whenever we are needed, before in an amount of time that it's considered acceptable, right? So instead of trying to predict exactly how many people will be displaced tomorrow or how many people will be impacted by an event, we try to be prepared. So if anything happens, we will be ready, right? Being organizations or governments, for example. Then another impact that I just mentioned that it's very, very characteristic, as I mentioned, was the origin of the revenue, right? The revenue in a commercial supply chain comes from sales, and the revenue in a humanitarian supply chain comes from donations. And that makes a very big difference when you combine supply chain management with financial management, because the cash flow management is very different. You usually in a commercial supply chain, you have to work with finance and with CFO and with the finance managers to balance out payables and receivables and be able to accommodate to the sales patterns and the procurement patterns of the organization. In the case of a humanitarian supply chain, you usually have the cash in the bank from day zero once the donation is accepted. So that poses a very different paradigm in terms of how do you manage the cash in your supply chain, and how do you address the financial aspect of how do you pay your suppliers. And actually, it's usually a competitive advantage from a humanitarian actor to be able to pay fast. And finally, in terms of sustainability, the main difference between commercial supply chains and humanitarian supply chain is that humanitarian supply chain, and more recently, are seeking to be sustainable in terms of the ecological sense of it, but humanitarian supply chains are not economically sustainable. We are there because we're needed, but if the emergency ends or we cover the needs or the context changes, we step out from the context, right? So we are not seeking long-term sustainability of our operation, but to be able to deliver fast and to the people that are considered people of concern. And those are the main difference that we can find in humanitarian supply chain and commercial supply chains: the objective, the strategy between forecasting and preparedness, the source of revenue, and also the approach to economic sustainability. Then, getting a bit deeper to the supply chain management of humanitarian events, we can talk about procurement. And procurement has a very important role in humanitarian operations. And the first thing that you can think of procurement in humanitarian supply chain, it's how it is a pillar for operational support. So there are many humanitarian events that occur in countries that they are destabilized and the markets are not 100% functional. So being able to procure and find the right network of suppliers that will deliver in time what you need, it's actually a very important aspect for the programs to be implemented in time and to get to the people as soon as they need. Then another aspect that procurement has a very important role is regarding risk management. It's very important for humanitarian supply chains when you are ready to and you have prepared your suppliers. Maybe your demand for a certain kit or a certain blanket can be 5,000, or it can be 50,000, or it can be 500,000. So having the capacity to pool the resources of several suppliers and procure from several suppliers will mitigate the risk of purchasing everything from one supplier, and when they have financial struggle, you will be unable to deliver, right? And also the aspect of how fast you can respond, it's mostly a factor of how fast are your suppliers, because some organizations, they have assets that they hold in world-placed warehouses, like for example UN or the Red Cross. They have warehouses where they stockpile goods that they can deliver in case of an event. Of course, there are other organizations that we do not hold assets. We ask our suppliers to hold the assets and the inventory, and we ask them to deliver it to us, and we will deliver to the service once an event occurs. So that aspect of risk management in case of uncertainty or any event, it's a very important enabler that procurement gives to the humanitarian operations. Then another defining aspect of procurement is traceability. The humanitarian sector usually has a very deep focus on traceability of how they spend the funds, as the income that they receive is from donors. Those donors receive the funding to deliver from taxes or from a different set of pooling of resources that they do as multilateral actors. So they have actually very high requirements on that you as a humanitarian actor are able to say, how have you spent this money that I gave you? And the level of traceability required, it's very often as high as, for example, the pharmaceutical industry might have. So for example, when I buy a humanitarian kit, or I have a warehouse with hundreds of humanitarian hygiene kits, for example, I have to be able to say which kit was bought in which purchase order from the approval of which project manager, from which donor were the funds, and what was the invoice. And when I delivered, I have to be able to say to which beneficiary. So that is kind of an example, as if you take a box of milk and you're able to say from which cow the milk was extracted, right? And you ask that to the retailer. It's very high level of traceability that is required for humanitarian actors. And actually being able to have a traceable procurement, it's one of the main investment in internal and administrative costs that humanitarian actors have, at least in non-governmental humanitarian actors. And finally, the last part of that where procurement it's very relevant. It's in providing the best value for money. Sometimes the urgency of an emergency makes the project managers and program managers to ask for goods as soon as they can, and ask for the first supplier that they can find for the goods to be procured. And sometimes a structured procurement process allows you to have savings in the double digits very often when you procure, and that is something that you will actually show to the donors what was the effectiveness of your competitive procurement in your supply chain. And the last aspect that I wanted to talk about, and I think is very relevant and one of the very attractive things of humanitarian supply chain, it's the global aspect of procurement. So as I've been mentioning, humanitarian operations occur in contexts that they are where you don't have what you always you don't always have what you need, and additionally, if you have it, it might be very expensive, or it might be not of the best quality. So it's very often that you have to source some key products and items from external countries or worldwide supply chains. And sometimes humanitarian organizations have multi-country operations, and we set up supply lines from country A to country B, or from country A to country B to country C. So you can deliver in this country where you are, where a displacement or emergency has occurred, and you have to have actually to collaborate within the organization to be able to set up these global and international supply lines. Another aspect that is very critical for us, it's what is the local market capacity. So, for example, when we talk about the type of supply chains that you can have, depending on the type of assistance that you deliver, if you deliver in-kind aid, for example, let's say grain, food, and you deliver food in a country, and that country has its own food market and food agricultural market, you will be impacting that market, right? So being able to understand how the external supplies that you're bringing from other countries will affect local markets can actually be a key factor if you are doing harm with your assistance, or you're actually covering needs because you are, for example, providing supplies in a counter-cyclical moment, right? And another big part of the global aspect of procurement, it's donor sourcing constraints. Usually the donors that provide you funds, they will have their agenda, their constraints, and their requirements for you to perform vetting in the suppliers that you have. So sometimes there will be, for example, a way to fly inside a country, and you will not be able to hire that airline because it's vetted by the donor. Or, for example, you will find this cheap supplier in the other side of the world, and when you do the vetting, there will be constraints from this donor for if you procured from that supplier. So that awareness of the global aspect and the implications of from who do you procure regarding who is your donor is a very key aspect that right now there's a lot of technology invested in automate this task, but it's still a a process that we are working as a humanitarian organization according to the requirements that donors put on us. And finally, the last part, I think that is one of the biggest challenges is the delivery cost. When you are trying to address an international emergency and you don't have the local means that you have to source internationally, you are probably sourcing in a logistic network that has emerged for that emergency. So prices are usually very high, and the humanitarian sector works a lot with sometimes UN agencies, sometimes with governments, or sometimes amongst the humanitarian actors and humanitarian organizations to pool logistic resources to reduce that delivery cost in international sourcing operations, because the cost, and actually there's some empiric evidence that for certain humanitarian organizations, the cost of procurement can go up to 60%, depending on the type of project. So it's very critical that you have the right logistic capacities to deliver to this unstructured situation or this country that is having an emergency with the adequate logistic cost for you as an organization and for the donors. And this is what I wanted to tell you about humanitarian supply chains, about the types, the procurement, and the context of global procurement. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoy the content, and I urge you to go and make a difference if you are interested in working in the sector.